coming, everyone. And thank you for Dr. Martina Meisnar for joining us today. And first, I will start with a brief introduction about our speaker and this talk for today. So Dr. Meisnar graduated with a PhD from the University of Oxford in 2015. Since then, she's became a research fellow, and now she is a materials and process engineer at the European Space Agency. And today she's going to give us a talk about the AM application in space and the lessons learned, and also how the additive manufacturing has been upscaled in the space application. And welcome. Yes, so anytime you want to start, please.
Okay, let me just quickly. Can you see just my slides now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I have two screens, so sometimes it's a bit confusing. Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction. As was introduced, my name is Martina, and I'm a materials and process engineer at ESA. I started after my PhD at ESA in Harwell near Oxford, where we created the so-called ESA Advanced Manufacturing Laboratory. So my work was a lot related to setting up this lab, buying all the equipment, and then starting on doing some research for ESA in this laboratory. And now, 5 years later, we have quite a nice lab that is concentrated on metallurgy. So we do a lot of materials characterization, as you probably know from your work as well. And our main focus is the world of advanced manufacturing. And part of advanced manufacturing is also additive manufacturing, which is something that's very big in ESA at the moment, and also in different industries like automobile and so on. So this is something that's very new and starting to mature quite a lot in terms of products that are used in high value industries, I would say. So I would like today to tell you a little bit about where we started, what lessons we've learned, what we achieved in the past, and the next challenges. So first of all, let me introduce you to ESA, the European Space Agency. We have 22 member states and about 5,000 employees, but that number is not so accurate, I think. We have our headquarters in Paris and 7 sites across Europe, as well as a spaceport in French Guiana. So whenever we fly a mission, we would most likely fly it on an Ariane or a Vega rocket from French Guiana. And this is whatever we're doing, we do this for about the value of 12 euros per European per year. It's actually quite cheap for the public, I think, to an amount to do all the different projects and missions we do. And what we do is can be shortly described as we are exploring and using space for exclusively peaceful purposes. So you can see here a map of the ESA member states. I thought that's quite interesting. Don't worry, the UK will stay an ESA member state despite Brexit happening, because we also have Canada who are a member state, and they're not a EU country, so there's no problem there. So ESA, when you go on the website, it says ESA is Europe's gateway to space. Its mission is to shape the development of Europe's space capability and ensure that all the investment in space continues to benefit basically you, so every one of us, in terms of you see a lot of navigation satellites that we need for our navigation systems. Galileo is a very prominent one. We have a lot of telecommunications satellites that help us with, communicating with each other. We do a lot of Earth observation. You might have heard of the Sentinel satellites that go around the world and actually map the environment, the weather, and so on. So we have a lot of environmental satellites. And we also do many other things, including exploration of Mars, the moon. We fly people to the ISS, and we do a lot of space science. Like you may have heard a few years ago with we're going to comets and try to extract some samples from there and bring them back to Earth, which is quite exciting. So yeah, we do all of that for 12 euros per European. So this is actually quite nice, I think. And here you see a number of different mission directorates and a few missions that we support. So I spoke to Stella before about our work at ESA in the materials section, and we support all of these missions. So one of the materials engineers is usually in charge of supporting a mission, and we follow them from the very early design stages throughout the design reviews and the materials manufacture readiness reviews and so on, until the satellite is actually assembled and tested, and then it goes into transport to the spaceport. So we help in every stage, and we have to look at the list of materials. So every material that is on such a satellite has to be listed, and we go through them and make sure that all these materials are able to be used in space. And sometimes we get some, when there's a qualification of a component and it doesn't go quite as planned and it fails, then we also get those materials back to us, and we have to try to find out why they failed and make some suggestions of how to improve the part. So that's quite exciting work. So just to summarize, materials and processes at ESA, we try to ensure that materials and manufacturing processes that are used to assemble a spacecraft or a launcher are fit for purpose over the entire life of the mission. And when I say the entire life of the mission, that means actually from the assembly stage of the satellite throughout the transport. So, you know, if a satellite is oftentimes assembled in Toulouse in France, and then it has to be shipped to the spaceport, which is in South America. So a lot can actually go wrong during that phase. And then oftentimes it takes a while. We have to wait for a launch because of different reasons, and the satellite has to be stored. And the storage in a salty sea environment is also very critical, especially maybe Stella is interested in this because of corrosion. So there's a lot of corrosion happening during the long-term storage of a satellite until it waits for being launched into space. So this is also quite critical. So what do we do? This is just a list of things. I think it's maybe not so important to mention all of these, but yeah, we give support to the projects. I've already talked about this. We try to develop advanced materials and manufacturing technologies in order to sustain and enable future missions. So we try to always achieve to get better at what we're doing. We're trying to also provide independent test facilities for people that don't have their own. We try to put out standards as well as we can in order to regulate the production of satellites for space missions. It's in the framework of the so-called ECSS standards. And we also act as a certification authority. And the last point is actually really important. We as ESA, we try to promote the scientific knowledge. We want to make people talk about their science. We do, if someone comes to us with IP, we do not share knowledge of a company, but we do try to promote people sharing information, because we don't want people to do the same investigation twice. We want to make sure that everything is done with properly using the budget that is available in Europe to achieve the advanced materials and manufacturing technologies. Okay, so this is just a very brief slide about the technology development we do. So I spoke before about advanced materials and processes, where additive manufacturing is one of the areas we're looking at. We also look at advanced materials inspection. So maybe in your work that you do in Imperial, you do a lot of sectioning and materials, microstructure characterization and so on, which is all destructive. But in many of our cases, we actually need to use non-destructive inspection and testing in order to not destroy the components we make, because oftentimes it's so expensive to make one of these parts that we can only non-destructively investigate it. And we use something like X-ray CT, dye penetrant. So it's a bit of a different world, and I had to learn this myself when I moved from Oxford to from the corrosion area to the space technology. This is something that's really important. And we also look into other areas like in-orbit and on-planet manufacturing, which is very new. We've just started this. And also materials modeling is something we're trying to do now more often. Okay, so I've now arrived after an introduction to additive manufacturing. And these days, most people know what additive manufacturing means, but just in order to give you a short introduction to it, it's the layer-wise buildup of material to form a final part. This is as opposed to machining, for example, where you continuously subtractively remove material to make a part. So here we build a part layer-wise. It can be used with a multitude of materials now. A lot started in the polymer world, but then it went on to metals, and nowadays we can even do ceramics and composites with additive manufacturing. Our raw materials are usually powders. This is what I work with a lot. We have a powder characterization lab in Howell, but it can also be wire or slurry. And there's a multitude of different processes. I tried to make a list of all the different processes for this presentation, but it's impossible. There's so many nowadays. It's quite confusing actually, because the terminology changes as well. But if I just briefly show you the process. So we start from a powder, which looks like this, and in the microscope it looks like that ideally. So these are very nice powder particles here, very round. And then it goes through the additive manufacturing process, and this is the selective laser melting process. This is one of the many that exist, and you can see it's called a powder bed process, because you basically have a bed of powder in which the part is being built, and every layer, the roller or the wiper goes across and deposits another layer of material on top. And that is then melted with the laser to form the final part. And the piston goes down. So in this particular machine, this is not the same for all machines, but the piston goes down, and in order to move the part further down, so the next layer can be deposited. So this is basically the setup. And out comes a really nice part. As you can see, this is an additively manufactured bracket that we've built that then comes out of this process. And I would like to show you now what we find so attractive about additive manufacturing. You see on the left the conventional part that fulfills exactly the same function as the AM part on the right. And as you can see already, there's much less material. I can also tell you that a lot less assembly steps have to be used to make this part, and there's less screws, there's less bolts that need to be in place in order to fix this part onto a spacecraft. So, but if you see in the middle, we have actually a 60% weight reduction. You probably saw from just looking at the left part that it seems much heavier than the one on the right, because we only put material where it belongs. So with finite element analysis, the engineers calculate where all the load paths are, and they only put the material where it's actually needed. And that's how we get this alien shape, I would say, on the right here. And we get also a lot of benefits. So weight reduction is one. We also have a lead time reduction because this part can be manufactured much quicker in the entire manufacturing chain. And on this slide, something that's called the buy-to-fly ratio is very important in the space industry, because every kilo that goes up into space can be worth around between 10 to 50,000 pounds. So every kilo that we can take off, we save a lot of money, and that's called the buy-to-fly ratio. And that's reduced on this part by 97%. So it's incredible what we can do with this manufacturing technology. And this is the reason why it's been booming so much in the space industry. And that's actually where I'm going now. So what are the challenges for materials and processes in space? We require low mass, first of all. So for the reasons I just stated. We also have a very small production series. So we build maybe one part for a satellite, or two maximum, because we will have one that's being tested, which is called the engineering model. And we will have one that is the flight model, which actually goes into the satellite. So very small production series. We need a high reliability and high performances, obviously, for the materials, because they have to sustain very high loads throughout the mission. They also, we have different types of geometries, so small to large. So you maybe know certain processes like metal injection molding and so on. So some processes are not useful for larger or complex geometries. They're more specified for like high amount of parts to be generated. So this is something that's in our case, it can be anything, basically any geometry. We have a challenging material procurement, which means basically we need very solid procurement chains. We need to rely on the part being ready when we need it, because otherwise any delay would cause huge losses in terms of the mission cost. So when you look at this list, and probably you can find more points as well, additive manufacturing seems particularly suitable to address those challenges. And that's why we've been looking into it so much in the recent past. So our mission is now to try to push and enable industry, the people that actually make the satellites, and the few companies are shown on the right here below the part that I'm showing. We try to push them into the direction of using more additively manufactured parts on their missions and on their spacecrafts, because we need them to get some confidence in these parts, because everything in space is based on heritage. So something that's flown for 20 years, that's a part that's been over and over again established to be fine in a satellite, it will always be favored in a sense, because we don't need to develop something new. So there's a bit of a pressure against this new development as well. And we're trying to surmount that challenge and try to get past it with our activities. Okay, so now I would like to quickly show you how our timeline was from basically starting in 2005, where my colleague Laurent, who's been mentioned on the first slide, he was the first one in ESA to actually start the first activity related to additive manufacturing and just explore this new technology. And it was found that it was pretty useful. And so we had several more activities that I will speak to you about in a second. After that, we had a workshop, which means that ESA is sort of supporting the development of additive manufacturing. We had then some activities that actually targeted products, so flight products, trying to develop into something that would actually fly on a satellite. Then we had the roadmap, which is basically our vision on how we will implement additive manufacturing in order to be flown in the future on satellites. And I can tell you it's already been done. So there are additively manufactured parts that are flying in space right now. And we also, I spoke to you about standardization before, our system of ECSS standards, which basically lay out a framework of rules on how you have to produce a part to be allowed on a space mission. And we're doing this right now for additive manufacturing for powder bed fusion processes. So very soon we will issue our first standard on that. So this is already a big achievement because these things are normally very slow, as you can imagine. And I will just show you a few examples now on this timeline. But first of all, this is an image that I really like to show because I think it's very related to how we experience the learning curve in additive manufacturing. We started at basically a zero knowledge. We had no idea if this is something that would work. And it looked like fun at the beginning because it's mind-blowing how complex the parts can be that you can make, and it's really exciting technology. But then you go through somewhat of a up and down curve because you don't really understand the process. You don't know why the part failed when you then fatigue tested it, for example, and so on. And I would say we're probably around here at the moment after about 15 years, and we start to really understand the process and we know what we can do with it. But we also try new things, and that makes us actually go back all the way to zero sometimes on the learning curve. So it's actually more of a circle, I would say, that brings us back to stage zero sometimes in certain developments as well. Okay, so I'll show you some examples now to show you also some pictures and illustrate what we do. So you can see on this slide a so-called water on-off valve, which was actually on the ISS at some point, and it failed. And the reason that it failed was corrosion again. So you see here, this is corrosion is always an important topic. But it was brought back to Earth and inspected. And for no particular reason, this part was then selected to be our first part that would be additively manufactured. And the reason was it actually has quite a complex internal geometry, some welds, as you can see between the part. I don't know if you see my cursor, but you have basically two parts that were welded together in this part. One is the main part, and one is the one with the screwed section on the right hand side where the arrow is on top. So you see that there's a big weld between the two. So this is always, welds are always a potential issue because they can deteriorate the material properties at that point, and if you then stress it, it can actually cause cracking and failure. So we reproduced the same part with additive manufacturing. You can see now the weld is gone. It's replaced by millions of little welds, which are a part of the AM process from the laser melting of the powder. And we actually, first we tried to print it with the same material, which was stainless steel. But we suddenly realized we don't need the same material, because the reason for manufacturing this with stainless steel was probably convenience. Stainless steel is a very sturdy material, as you probably know. It can withstand high loads. It's quite benign in terms of corrosion and so on, although not in this particular part. But it also has its negative sides. It's heavy and it sometimes has some other issues that needs to be taken into account. So we actually replaced it by titanium, and we found that we actually can have 40% of mass saving by just replacing the material. And titanium is a material that is a bit hard to machine, and therefore it was probably not used before on the machined part. So now, using additive manufacturing, we have a new avenue of using different materials because they are manufacturable more easily with this process. So to show you a few pictures, this is the part after being additively manufactured, taken out of the powder bed. So you see all the powder around it. Someone's just with a brush trying to get rid of the powder. Powder removal is something that is quite important because you don't want it stuck in internal parts. And this is something we only realized later, because you actually have to design the part in the CAD software. So powder removal is always possible. So you don't want to have any internal cavities where the powder cannot be removed. This is what it's as built after the powder is removed. You can also see here support structures. These are the vertical struts that are going down from different parts. And you can see that these are actually detached here. So in this case, we noticed that the support structures weren't perfect. So this is something that would need to be improved as well. Next, we see some overhangs and some high surface roughness. And surface roughness is something that's very inherent with the additive manufacturing process. And it depends on which process you choose, but you always have residual surface roughness. So if you don't want your part to be rough for, let's say, fatigue property reasons, you will need to think about polishing it at the end, or machining, post-machining it, electrochemically cleaning the surface, or whatever you can think of. But yeah, the parts are quite rough. And here you can see, again, the comparison between the conventional and the additively manufactured parts. So the left is titanium and the right one is the stainless steel. So this was our first try, and we did discover some problems. And so we tried to learn our lessons and implement them in future studies. Here you can see the next study was for a mirror. So this is actually a functional part here now. In the original design, you have, you actually see you have a higher mass. And the key for this mirror is obviously the surface finish. It needs to be very smooth and mirror-like. And the decoupling from the base plate. So you can see the base plate and the mirror need to be very strongly decoupled from each other in terms of avoiding any vibrations that could cause optical interferences. So we basically redesigned the part. As you can see in the middle picture, there's some lattice structures on the sides that replace the solid material, which makes it lighter. You can also see that the decoupling was achieved with a different design. And I'm pretty sure that this was actually modeled in the computer in order to optimize the decoupling of vibrations from the mirror. And you can also see on the right-hand picture then, we had to think in terms of the coating, because all these optical devices usually have a nickel phosphorus coating applied. So the material first has to be post-machined to be very smooth, and the nickel coating has to be applied. And I can tell you, in space, applying coatings is one of the main challenges, because you have to get it very clean, and the coating has to basically last for a very long time under very hard conditions, like a lot of thermal shocks, where you go through very hot phases and very cold phases. So there's a lot of problems that can be caused by improperly applied coating. So this had to be also established that the process could do that. So yeah, this was actually a success. And we had the same optical performance whilst gaining a lot of mass benefits here. So this was quite a good example of a device that can be additively manufactured. Another example I would like to show you is we're starting to design now for additive manufacturing. What does that mean? So you're looking at an RF filter, which you can see on the right-hand side. When it's machined, it has these cavities because the waves basically have to follow this cavity pattern, and it's produced with two parts that are the same, and they're then screwed together to have these internal cavities. And you can see already, hopefully, on the slide, that the machining of these cavities is not very accurate, and it has some tracks that you can see afterwards. So this design of these rectangular shapes is not ideal, I would say. So with the additive manufacturing process, we can now design this part so it actually optimizes the performance of the RF filter in terms of the waves. We know exactly what kind of waves need to go into this filter because it's designed by an RF engineer and for a very specific function and purpose. So the internal cavities can now be shaped in this form that you see on the slide here. And we can reduce misalignment and errors very effectively. So what you see on the right now is basically the 3D printed part, which has the internal cavities in this rounder shape, as you see in the middle of the slide. So we actually managed to improve the performance of this part a lot by designing it for additive manufacturing. So the RF filter works much better than before. And you can also see we have this silver coating on top, which is something that's apparently, I'm not sure exactly what the function was here, but it had to be applied internally and externally. So this brought us to the conclusion that we actually have to design these parts in order to, we have to already think in the design stage what sort of post-processing we need to apply in order to access all the cavities with the silver coating. So this is something that we realized then, that the design through the manufacturing, through the application of post-processing and the testing, it's all one chain. It's the so-called end-to-end process chain that needs to be considered. Here is a nice little example. It's a thrust chamber, and this is an interesting story because these were usually produced with platinum, and you know platinum is very expensive, but they were actually machined. So you had a block of platinum, they would be machined down, and a lot of material would be lost. I mean, not lost, they would recycle it, but you as the customer who pays for it, it's a very expensive part. And so making this thrust chamber out of platinum with additive manufacturing, where you basically have zero or almost zero loss of material, was a huge achievement. And you can see it here. I can try to even show this video. So this is a hot fire test of the thrust chamber. And this was the final test that was done on this additively manufactured part. And it was a successful test at the end, where basically a propellant is blown through the chamber, and I think with an infrared camera they measured the heat distribution and it was fine. The sad part of the story is that this is a chemical propulsion part, and after this project there was a paradigm shift in the European space industry from chemical propulsion to electrical propulsion, especially for the small thrusters. So it doesn't have a lot of use anymore, this part. So that was a bit of a sad part of the story, but in the end it was still a success. Okay, so we learned a couple of lessons. I will skip through them because I think I mentioned everything to you, and I don't want to, you know, explode the time frame of this presentation too much. I can also share the presentation with you, with Stella, and she can distribute it. It's no problem. So the last thing I said with the RF part, we're now wiser and we're thinking end-to-end manufacturing, which means already at the design stage, we're thinking of the testing and post-processing as well. So this is our end-to-end manufacturing process. It goes from the design to the material supply through processing, post-processing and testing. And for example, let's say you want to visually inspect the part, you have to actually make sure that it's accessible already in the design stage. If you want to remove surface roughness on an internal part of the geometry, you need to make sure it's accessible for that. So what we do now in all of our projects, we make the companies define the end-to-end process chain at the very beginning and think about all of these things at the start before even any processing happens. Okay, this brings me to our current areas of study after a brief history of time, more or less. And these are the topics I'm going to show you now. So I'm showing you a few examples of where we are, what kind of parts we're making right now. So we have a launcher program, which is the Future Launches program. You can see the Ariane 5 upper stage there. And there's this bracket. Brackets are very often used in our industry because you basically, what you do is you have to connect the spacecraft platform to a component. So for example, an optical telescope would always be mounted on a bracket to be connected to the platform. So this is why these brackets sustain a lot of loads, but they also have to sustain the thermal expansion and contraction. So this is really important. So in this particular case, we tried to make this so-called ISCA bracket. You can see the machined part here. This is a development that's going on right now, and it looks quite bulky. We're trying to make this as an additively manufactured bracket, and the current calculations show that it's about 30% mass savings, and you can imagine how much money we save if we have about 50k euros per kilogram. So this is really an interesting project. The next one is another bracket that's on that wants to go on the Sentinel-1 satellite. You can already see the design here. On the left, again, the original design, and on the right, the alien-shaped final design for this Ruach bracket, which looks completely different, but you see the interfaces are all the same. So the interface to the platform is fixed, and the interface to the component is fixed, but everything between, we only put material where it needs to go. And that's all calculated with a design loop of finite element calculations until we arrive at that shape. Something else is that's a very, very big part. It's the so-called Athena optical bench. So Athena is an X-ray telescope, which will be on one of our next missions. Basically, this X-ray telescope has to be mounted on the so-called optical bench. And this bench fulfills two functions. First of all, it has to be very stiff in order to not bend and provide stability to the telescope. And the other thing is the coefficient of thermal expansion has to be very low in order not to introduce any disturbances to the telescope function, basically. So in this case, we would have a material trade-off, which makes sure that we have a material that maximizes the specific stiffness and minimizes the CTE. And in this case, it ended up being titanium 6-4, as far as I remember, because it fulfills exactly those functions. So you can see that, again, this is a bench that has 6 segments. It can't be manufactured all in one because it's too large. You can see it's 3 meters in diameter. So we are manufacturing it in sections. So this is ongoing right now as well. And something that's also very exciting is we're looking into on-planet and on-orbit manufacturing. So the idea here is, as on the right, you see tools and screws that are used by astronauts. And it would be really useful if they don't have to bring all of these tools and screws on the launcher into space. It would actually be useful for them to actually additively manufacture them on the ISS or on the moon. So this is something we're working on right now, additive manufacturing in orbit and on planet. And on the left-hand side, you can see a so-called building block. So this is for, in order to bring people to Mars, for example, we're thinking in terms of making a moon base first, and using that as an interim stage. And we would need protection there for our astronauts. And an idea, and this is really concept phase at the moment, is to use the resources that are on the planet. So this is manufactured with geological moon dust that's basically simulated with Earth geological material and sintered with sunlight. So it's called solar sintered regolith. And this is one of the building blocks you can see here. Something else, I hope I still have time, is what I personally am looking at the lab in Howell is powder, the powder supply chain and powder procurement for additive manufacturing. And the main question is, what is good powder? So as a quick teaser, more than anything, because of the time, these are 4 powders that are ordered to the same procurement specification by 4 different companies. And you can see from the micrographs, the SEM images, that they're all quite different, although I ordered them to the same spec. And what we can see, I skip through a few of these things here now, is we actually additively manufactured with these powders. 3 different manufacturers, and manufacturer 1 and 2 have the same machine, and manufacturer 3 has a different machine. And the same powder, in this case powder A, produces very different microstructures, as you can see, and especially in terms of the porosity. And porosity is one of the key properties after additive manufacturing. We want as little porosity as possible. So when you then take another powder with the same machine, we again get very different results. So we realized the powder procurement is actually really important, and we need to understand which powder with which machine makes a good part. So this is something that's going on at the moment as well. This is by far not complete yet, but what we want to understand is the link between the powder properties, the machine and process that we put this powder through, and the final part properties. And this is an ongoing study that we're doing right now, and is, I think, very important for our future missions. I think I'm on my last slide now. So I'm sure a few people in your department do modeling, and modeling is something I'm really not an expert with. But we recently had new additions to our team of people that do modeling. And in this particular case, we're trying to find new alloys for additive manufacturing. So if you take the example of aluminium silicon 10 magnesium, which is the most commonly used aluminium alloy for additive manufacturing, it's actually, I think it was meant to be a casting alloy, but it was, for some reason, it was quite easily additively manufacturable, and people stuck with it. But it definitely does not achieve the same properties as our conventionally produced 60, 61 or 70, 75 aluminium alloys that we often use on spacecrafts. So we're now looking into, instead of replacing with these parts with aluminium silicon 10 magnesium parts, we are now trying to find new aluminium alloys that are specifically targeted at the additive manufacturing process, which can give us high strength and ideally better thermal properties, because aluminium has quite a high coefficient of thermal expansion. So this is something that's a bit of a negative side of aluminium. So what people do is they look at Kalfad analysis and phase diagrams, and they try to understand what are the best additions, dopants, to put into these aluminium alloys to achieve high strength. And good corrosion properties is important for us. The most important is actually stress corrosion cracking. So we usually have to test for stress corrosion cracking because if the material doesn't meet our standards in terms of SCC, it cannot be used in space. For the reasons I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation with the salty sea environment. Obviously, in space itself, there's no real atmosphere, so we're not looking at corrosion in space that much. Okay, so I hope I gave you a good overview of what our activities are. So again, there's a conclusion and what we're working on and what we're trying to achieve in the future. I can share this presentation with you if you want to reread any of the details. And please also feel free to email me at my email address if you have any specific questions, although you can also ask me now.
Thank you. Fantastic seminar, Martina. This was awesome.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad you say that.
So Jingwei messaged me saying that he's having some internet problems, so I'm gonna lead the Q&A instead. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I have loads. So, okay, first, it's really, really cool that you're starting to manufacture the components either in orbit or like thinking of doing this on other planets as well. This is very cool, and especially with moon dust directly.
Yeah.
That was really amazing. The platinum piece, how big is that, the thruster?
Yeah, it would be about this big, I would say. Yeah, so it's a 10 Newton thruster, I think. So we have on our spacecrafts different propulsion systems. So first we have a big tank, which is basically a huge spherical barrel, or sometimes it has a cylindrical part inside, which is basically there to get the spacecraft into orbit. And that's usually chemical propulsion. So you have a chemical in there. These small thrusters are actually used for orbit maneuvering. So in order to, you have a lot of space debris, for example, already out there. So you want to make small changes in the orbits to change direction or change orbit slightly to avoid a part that's coming at you. So that's what these small thrusters are for. And they're really small. They're usually placed on different ends of the spacecraft. And unfortunately for this particular thruster, and I mean, fortunately, I think for all of us, because it was very expensive to make these parts out of platinum. But now we use a lot of electrical propulsion for that, and that's completely different.
Okay, so I think you're one of the only people who has ever made a component that big out of platinum.
It is striking. Yeah, it was kind of also a first and the last for us. These things aren't produced anymore. Yeah.
Oh wow! So Minson Pham has a question. I see a hand up. Do you want to?
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very nice talk. I just have a quick question. When you change from stainless steel to titanium alloy for one component, I'm just curious about not only about the mass reduction, but also about other requirements for that component, like radiation or something, because I think stainless steel might have a better radiation resistance than titanium alloy, and also for the processing, the fabrication of stainless steel might be easier than titanium alloy in terms of powder bed fusion. Could you please comment on that?
Yes, yes. So material selection is a very important task in spacecraft. So, and I could probably give you another presentation on that, because there's a lot of factors involved. And for us, the first few are always looking at the mass. So clearly, titanium has a benefit over stainless steel in terms of mass. And again, stress corrosion is the next thing we look at, because if it's not stress corrosion resistant, we don't touch it, basically. In this particular case, you're completely right. I would say it was machined. And machining is much easier for stainless steel in terms of manufacturing it than titanium. Titanium for powder bed fusion is actually quite a stable process nowadays. So this is something I wouldn't, stainless steel too, but titanium, I wouldn't say it's less reliable, the production in terms of powder bed fusion. We do it quite a lot. So titanium and aluminium are our main targets. So for this particular part, I don't know the history, but it was produced conventionally with stainless steel, because I think it was a water on-off valve. So it was also used as a mechanical device that needed a certain rigidity, I would say. And with the water, I would say that the stainless steel protects quite well from that functionality, I would say. So that's probably why they made it with stainless steel. But if we can actually replace this with a new material, the engineers at the time decided titanium would be a good candidate as well, because of the mass reduction. And it is really the mass in this case, I think, because it's a bulky part that you saw, and the titanium is much lighter and can reduce the mass much better. But it was never actually used in space, this part. So it could have been that they also made the decisions based on some other criteria.
So it isn't exposed to the solar wind, so like radiation. So we do not need to worry about like a radiation damage or something similar.
We do think about radiation. So you have cosmic radiation, which can be solar particles. You can have some heavy particles, like I think larger ions that are caused also by sun protuberances and so on. You get particles from somewhere else in space. I'm not a radiation specialist, but in the spacecraft, we mainly worry about the electronics. So the radiation is mainly an issue for the electronics on board of the spacecraft. So we usually put the electronics into the center, so it's covered by many different layers of spacecraft structure around it. That usually is quite good at preventing any radiation damage.
Yeah, may I have another quick question about printing in space? I could guess. I'm just curious about what would be the strategy for printing in space, because powder bed fusion probably not the best technique for printing in space because of no gravity. I mean, or microgravity is different. Then powder would flow away. So what could be the best technique? Is it like the FDM, like the fused deposition modeling? But I don't think powder bed could be the best technique for
You're correct. Powder bed causes issues in terms of health and safety, especially if you think of the astronauts floating in the International Space Station. If powder's floating there, it can block filters, it can go into the life support system. It's really not ideal. So they are working on it, though. People are working on trying to develop powder bed fusion, but what's been done so far was, as you said, filament processes are quite prominent. Binder jetting filaments, so where you have the powder, you have either wire or filament that's being used, or you have the powder encapsulated in a slurry, which was the third type of material. So you have a binder jetting process where the slurry is deposited, so you can contain it quite well. that's all a possibility. But we're still looking into which are the best processes to be used.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, that's very nice talk. Thank you again.
Thanks.
So I don't know if you had met Mince on FAM before, but he's running a group at Imperial on additive manufacturing.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so we printed quite a lot with stainless steel and Ti-64, but we found printing stainless steel is much easier than Ti-64. But yeah, otherwise we can get quite good quality for Ti-64 as well.
So what we use stainless steel for mainly is bolts and screws, and we need these elements to be structurally very sound, and in terms of the friction, you can't use titanium screws because you would need, it's not a good material to be used. It has a lot of stiffness and strength, but it has a lot of wear. And you would need a lubricant to actually use it as a screw. So in only various rare occasions we would use titanium screws. So we usually go to stainless steel for these types of structural parts.
Yeah, thank you. That's very useful information. Yeah, thank you very much again.
Are there any other questions? Does anyone else want to ask anything? Okay, if not, thank you very much, Martina. We are out of time, but your talk was absolutely amazing, super interesting, and yeah, manufacturing on other planets and in orbit is a fantastic new prospect. So you've given us a lot of inspiration.
We're just starting, and maybe in a few years' time I can come back and show you some results from that. Yeah, I have a PhD student who is in Edinburgh, and he's developing additive manufacturing for on a planet. So yeah, hopefully we will get some new results. And thanks for inviting me. It was really interesting also to meet your group. And again, the invitation, you can email me at any time of questions is open.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
All right, thank you for the seminar. Very insightful, and I hope you have a nice day.
Yeah, you too. All the best for your research, everyone.
Thank you. All the best. See you.
Bye.
Bye.